Oh, don't mind Martha. She's just the nanny I hired for the children. She doesn't need to be included in the school planning committee. Those words from Caroline's lips at the PTA meeting shattered something inside me. After 45 years, running my own successful interior design business, after helping put Caroline through an Ivy League education, after selling my cherished Victorian home to help them buy their dream house in Oakwood Estates, after dropping everything to help raise my grandchildren when Caroline's law career demanded more of her time, this is what I had become in her eyes. Just the nanny. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I sat frozen on the uncomfortable plastic chair in the elementary school cafeteria, surrounded by other parents and teachers who now looked at me with that particular blend of pity and dismissal reserved for household staff. The registration form for the school planning committee still clutched in my trembling hand. I had only suggested that Maggie, my 8-year-old granddaughter, might benefit from the advanced reading program. What Caroline didn't know, what my own daughter couldn't possibly realize as she casually dismissed me in front of everyone, was that just yesterday I had finalized the paperwork, updating my will and estate plan. My financial advisor, Agnes, had spent months helping me structure everything, including the $3.2 million trust fund I had established for my grandchildren's future. A trust fund that, until yesterday, had named Caroline and her husband Rudy as co-trustees. Walking out of that elementary school, my cheeks burning with humiliation, I made a decision that would change our family dynamic forever. The grandmother who had been relegated to the role of just the nanny was about to demonstrate exactly how much power she actually wielded. I remember the drive home that afternoon with perfect clarity. The cherry blossoms along Riverside Drive, just beginning to bloom, the classical music playing softly on my car radio, the unusual calm I felt despite the storm raging inside me. It wasn't anger exactly, though that certainly simmered beneath the surface. It was something deeper, a profound disappointment coupled with the crystal-clear realization that I had allowed myself to be diminished, one small concession at a time. My phone rang 3 times during that 15-minute drive. Caroline? No. Doubt? Sensing she had crossed a line. I let it go to voicemail. This conversation wouldn't happen on her timeline, with her prepared excuses and practiced explanations that always made me question my own perceptions. No, this time I needed space to think, to plan, to decide what came next. My cottage on Maple Lane felt especially quiet that evening. After Arthur passed away 5 years ago, I'd downsized from our family home to this charming 2-bedroom with the garden I'd always wanted. Caroline had called it quaint, with that particular inflection, that managed to make it sound like a criticism. Yet this space had become my sanctuary, filled with treasures from our travels, Arthur's beloved book collection, and the peace I craved after decades of a busy, fulfilling career. I poured myself a glass of Arthur's favorite Bordeaux, a small ritual I maintained on difficult days, and sat at my cherrywood desk, the one piece of furniture I couldn't bear to part with when we sold the big house. Opening my laptop, I navigated to my email and found what I was looking for. The final documents from Agnes requiring just my electronic signature to make the changes to the trust official. My cursor hovered over the signature line as I thought about how we had arrived at this point. Caroline had always been ambitious, focused, determined, qualities Arthur and I had nurtured and admired. We'd supported her through private school, through Princeton, through law school at Yale. We'd celebrated each achievement, each milestone on her path to becoming the successful corporate attorney she was today. When she married Rudy, an investment banker with his own impressive credentials, we'd welcomed him warmly into our family, seeing in him the same drive and determination that had propelled Caroline forward. The grandchildren, Maggie and her brother Erwin, just turned 5, had been unexpected blessings. Caroline had always insisted she was too career-focused for children. Then Maggie arrived, and 3 years later, Erwin, upending Caroline's carefully structured world. That's when the calls started coming. Could I pick up Maggie from preschool? Could I watch Erwin for a few hours? Could I possibly keep them overnight while she and Rudy attended an important client dinner? Those requests, initially occasional, soon became expectations. My retirement plans, the art classes I'd wanted to take, the travel I'd dreamed of, the volunteer work at the cultural center, gradually faded as I rearranged my life around my grandchildren's schedules. Arthur, in the last year of his life, had gently suggested that perhaps Caroline was taking advantage of my eagerness to be involved. "Set some boundaries, Martha," he'd advised. "You're her mother, not her employee." But I dismissed his concerns. These were our grandchildren, after all. What greater joy could I have than being part of their daily lives? And truthfully, after Arthur's sudden heart attack left me adrift in grief, the children became my anchors to the world, to the future, to joy itself. I never asked for payment. The very idea seemed absurd. Caroline occasionally made offhand comments about how much money they were saving on childcare, but always with the implication that this was the natural order of things. Grandmothers looking after grandchildren. And perhaps it was. But grandmothers weren't nannies. They weren't staff. They weren't people to be dismissed and diminished in public. My phone buzzed with a text message. "Mom, about what happened at school today. Rudy says I should talk to you. Call me back?" I set the phone aside without responding. There would be time for conversations later. Right now, I needed to make decisions with clarity rather than emotion. I clicked the signature line on Agnes's document and watched as my electronic signature appeared, making official what I had already decided in my heart. Caroline and Rudy would no longer control the trust fund for my grandchildren. That responsibility would rest with me alone as sole trustee until the children reached the age I deemed appropriate for them to manage their own inheritance. It wasn't about the money, not really. It was about respect, about recognition, about refusing to be erased from my own family narrative. As I closed my laptop, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. The straight-backed resolve that had helped me build my design business from nothing. The clarity of purpose that comes from standing firmly in your own worth. Caroline had defined me as just the nanny today. Tomorrow, I would begin redefining myself on my own terms. The morning after the PTA meeting, I awakened with unexpected clarity. My normal routine, tea with honey, 15 minutes with the crossword puzzle, a quick check of the weather forecast, felt suddenly inadequate for the day ahead. This wasn't going to be an ordinary Thursday. This was the day I reclaimed my identity. Caroline had called 3 more times last night and left increasingly concerned voicemails. The last one, time-stamped 11:42 p.m., had a sharp edge to it. "Mom, you're being childish. It was just a slip of the tongue. Call me back. We need to discuss tomorrow's schedule with the kids. Just a slip of the tongue." As if accidentally calling your mother the nanny in front of an entire PTA committee was something that happened to everyone. As if the words hadn't revealed exactly how she viewed my role in her carefully curated life. I dressed with particular care that morning, choosing the jade silk blouse Arthur had given me for our 40th anniversary and the pearl earrings that had been my mother's. Not the casual clothes I typically wore for a day with the grandchildren, but the attire of a woman who had once commanded respect in boardrooms and design consultations across the country. At precisely 9:15 a.m., I called Agnes instead of returning. Caroline's calls. "Martha, I see you signed the trust amendment," Agnes said after our brief pleasantries. "We'd been friends for 30 years, long enough that we didn't waste time on unnecessary conversation." "Are you certain about this?" "Caroline won't take it well." "Caroline has made her position quite clear," I replied, the memory of yesterday's humiliation still fresh. "How soon will everything be finalized?" "It already is. The moment you signed, it became official. I've assigned the trust identification number and set up the separate accounts as we discussed. You have complete discretionary control over distributions until the children reach 35, with the educational exceptions we outlined. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The trust was secure. Whatever happened between Caroline and me, Maggie, and Erwin's future was protected, on my terms, not their parents. There's something else, I said, the idea having formed sometime during the restless night. The lake house in Pinewood. I'd like to transfer it into the trust as well. Agnes's surprise was evident even through the phone. Arthur's family property? Caroline's been expecting to inherit that directly. It's worth at least $1 million given the lakefront location. Precisely, I said. The children should have it eventually. Caroline and Rudy have made it clear they'd sell it the moment it came into their possession. They've called it an impractical asset too many times to count. Arthur's family lake house had been our sanctuary for decades, where we taught Caroline to swim, where we celebrated countless birthdays and anniversaries, where Arthur had proposed to me 50 years ago on the dock at sunset. The idea of it being sold to fund whatever luxury car or kitchen renovation Caroline and Rudy deemed essential made my stomach turn. I'll draw up the paperwork today, Agnes promised. And Martha, are you planning to tell Caroline about these changes? When the time is right, I replied. For now, I have grandchildren to care. 4. I hung up and prepared for my normal Thursday routine, picking up Erwin from his half-day preschool program and keeping him until Caroline finished work around 7. Only today wouldn't be normal at all. As I pulled into the preschool parking lot, I spotted Caroline's sleek black SUV already there, unusual for a Thursday. She typically delegated the preschool pickup to me, claiming court preparations kept her too busy. My heartbeat quickened as I parked beside her vehicle. Sure enough, Caroline was waiting in the lobby, Erwin's dinosaur backpack already in hand. She was dressed impeccably in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly mortgage payments, her expression a practiced blend of concern and irritation. "Mom, finally," she said, as if I were late rather than precisely on. We need to talk about yesterday. I've been calling you." "Hello, Erwin," I said, ignoring her and kneeling to my grandson's level. His face lit up with a gap-toothed smile that made my heart swell. "How was school today?" "I made a volcano," he announced proudly. "Teacher says I can bring it home next week when it's dry." "That's wonderful, sweetheart. I can't wait to see it erupt." I straightened, finally meeting Caroline's impatient gaze. "Yes, I saw your calls." "Then why didn't you answer?" The edge in her voice was unmistakable, the same tone she used with opposing counsel according to Rudy's dinner party. "Stories? Look, about yesterday?" "Not here," I interrupted quietly, nodding toward Erwin, who was watching our exchange with the keen interest children reserve for adult tensions. "We can discuss it once we're home. I've taken the afternoon off," Caroline said, clearly thrown by my calm demeanor. She'd expected tears, perhaps, or wounded silence, my usual responses to her dismissals. "I thought I'd take Erwin today, give you a break. Give me a break." As if my time with my grandson was a burden rather than a joy. As if she were doing me a favor by fulfilling her own parental duties. "That won't be necessary," I replied, keeping my tone pleasant for Erwin's benefit. "We have plans, don't we, Erwin?" "Dinosaur Park," he exclaimed, bouncing on his toes. "And you promised chocolate chip cookies, Nanny Martha." Nanny Martha. The name hit me like a physical blow, confirming what I had suspected. Caroline had been referring to me as the nanny at home as well. It wasn't a slip of the tongue. It was a deliberate reframing of my role, even to my own grandchildren. I maintained my smile with effort. "That's right, we do have cookie plans. And it's Grandma Martha, remember?" Caroline's phone chimed with a message and she glanced at it impatiently. "Fine. Take him today if you insist. We'll talk tonight when I pick him up. Around 7, as usual?" As usual. As if nothing had changed. as if she hadn't fundamentally altered our relationship with a few careless words. "We'll be at my house," I confirmed. "Erwin and I have quite an afternoon ahead of us." What Caroline didn't know was that I had already packed the car with more than just ingredients for cookies. There were photo albums carefully selected from my collection, the small wooden box containing Arthur's cufflinks and pocket watch that he'd wanted Erwin to have someday, and several carefully written letters I'd stayed up creating most of the night. Today wasn't just about cookies and dinosaurs. Today was about legacy and truth. Today, Erwin would begin learning about his real family history, not the sanitized, curated version Caroline presented to her colleagues and friends, but the authentic story of struggle, growth, love, and occasional magnificent failure that had shaped our family across generations. And later, when Caroline arrived to collect her son, we would have a long overdue conversation about respect, boundaries, and what it truly meant to be a grandmother, rather than just the nanny. The lake house had been in Arthur's family for 3 generations. As Erwin and I rolled cookie dough into small balls that afternoon, I told him stories about his grandfather that Caroline had either forgotten or chosen not to share. "Your grandpa Arthur wasn't always successful, you know," I said, helping Erwin space the cookies evenly on the baking sheet. "When we first met, he was working 2 jobs to put himself through night school." Erwin looked up at me with curious eyes, a smudge of chocolate on his cheek. "But Mommy says Grandpa was a big, important businessman." "He became one, yes, but that's not how he started." I slid the cookies into the oven and set the timer. "Your grandfather grew up poor, in a little apartment above his father's hardware store. He wore hand-me-down clothes and worked stocking shelves when he was not much older than your sister Maggie." While the cookies baked, I brought out the photo albums I'd packed earlier. The first one contained pictures from the early days, Arthur and me as newlyweds, standing proudly in front of the hardware store his father had nearly lost during the recession, the store that became the foundation of our eventual success. "See this?" I pointed to a faded photograph of a young Arthur in overalls, rearranging window displays. Grandpa Arthur learned everything about building materials in that little store. He knew which tools were best for which jobs, which woods were strongest, which paints would last the longest. I turned the page to show Erwin a picture of our first tiny apartment, hardly bigger than a modern walk-in closet. "We lived here when your mommy was born. 1 room with a kitchenette, a bathroom we shared with the neighbors, and so much hope for the future." What I didn't tell 5-year-old Erwin, but what Caroline certainly knew, was that we'd lived in that cramped apartment for 3 years while Arthur and I built our business. Crestwood Supplies began as a small specialty hardware store, then expanded into custom millwork, then high-end building materials for luxury developments. By the time Caroline was in elementary school, we had 3 locations across the state. By her high school graduation, we had 12 and were fielding buyout offers from national chains. Through it all, we'd worked punishing hours. Arthur managing operations and logistics, while I handled design services and client relations. We'd missed school plays and soccer games, compensating with expensive gifts and the promise that one day it would all be worth it. Caroline had grown, up witnessing our climb from modest beginnings to considerable wealth, but somehow she'd internalized only the end result, not the arduous journey. "When did Grandpa get rich?" Erwin asked with a child's directness, examining a later photo of our family in front of the sprawling colonial we'd built as our dream home when Caroline was 10. "Grandpa didn't think of himself as rich," I corrected, gently, wiping a bit of cookie dough from his small fingers. "He thought of himself as fortunate, and he always said our greatest fortune was our family." The oven timer interrupted us, and I busied myself removing perfectly golden cookies to the cooling rack. As Erwin watched with anticipation, I continued. "My story. By the time Grandpa and I were ready to retire, our company had grown very large. A bigger company wanted to buy it, and we decided to sell. That's when we had more money than we needed." "Like $1 trillion?" Erwin's eyes widened with a child's concept of wealth. I laughed softly. Not quite that much, but enough that Grandpa and I could do something very important. We could help others. We set up a foundation to help children go to college. We donated to hospitals, and we made sure your mommy had everything she needed for her education. I didn't mention the specific numbers. The $300,000 for Caroline's undergraduate and law school education, the $75,000 down payment on her first condo, the $250,000 wedding that Arthur had insisted on paying for entirely, despite Rudy's family's considerable resources. I didn't mention the $850,000 we'd contributed toward their current home in Oakwood Estates, nor the annual family gifts we'd provided to help with everything from luxury vacations to Caroline's Mercedes. What we'd given Caroline and Rudy over. The years would have been enough to fund several middle-class families' entire lives. We'd done it willingly, joyfully, wanting to provide our only child with advantages we'd never had. But somewhere along the way, those advantages had transformed from gifts into expectations, from generosity into obligation. When the cookies had cooled enough, I put 2 on a plate for Erwin and poured him a small glass of milk. As he munched, happily, I opened another album, this one dedicated to my own career. While Grandpa was building his company, Grandma was working too, I explained, showing him photographs of design projects I'd completed over the years. I started helping people make their homes beautiful. First just friends, then clients, then, eventually, I had my own design studio with 20 people working for me. Did you make lots of money too? Erwin asked between bites of cookie. I did well, I said, smiling at his innocent curiosity about wealth. But what made me happiest was creating spaces where families could build memories together, just like we're doing right now in this kitchen. What I didn't explain to Erwin was that my design business had actually outperformed Arthur's in several years, particularly when I secured contracts for entire luxury developments and commercial properties. I'd built a reputation that attracted clients from across the country, published 2 books on interior design, and been featured in national magazines. Caroline had observed all of this growing up, but somehow in her narrative, I had become merely her father's supportive wife rather than his equal partner in success. As Erwin finished his cookies, I showed him one final photograph, Arthur and me on our 40th anniversary, standing on the dock at the lake house, silver-haired but still vibrant, still very much in love. Grandpa Arthur made me promise something before he went to heaven. I told Erwin, my voice softening. He made me promise to make sure you and Maggie knew where you came from. Not just the nice houses and the comfortable life, but the hard work, the disappointments, the persistence, and the love that built everything we have. Erwin nodded solemnly, though I knew he couldn't fully comprehend the weight of that promise or how it was driving my actions today. Is Mommy coming soon? He asked, his attention span for family history reaching its natural limit. Yes, I said, closing the album and checking my watch. And we have just enough time to get cleaned up before she arrives. Why don't you go wash? Your hands and face, and I'll put these pictures away? As Erwin scampered off to the bathroom, I carefully returned the albums to the box I'd prepared. Phase 1 of my plan, beginning to share our true family history with my grandchildren, was complete. Phase 2 would begin when Caroline arrived, expecting to collect her son and continue with business as usual. But there would be nothing usual about this evening's conversation. Nothing usual at all about the boundaries I intended to establish. The lake house title transfer papers from Agnes sat ready on my desk, along with printed statements of the newly restructured trust fund, visual aids for the revelation that just the nanny had been quietly holding the family's financial future in her hands all along. The headlights of Caroline's SUV swept across my living room windows precisely at 7:15 p.m., 15 minutes later than promised, but early by her standards. I smoothed my slacks and took a steadying breath. Erwin had fallen asleep on the couch after our busy afternoon, his small face peaceful, one hand still clutching the wooden toy boat Arthur had carved for him last Christmas. I opened the door before Caroline could ring the bell and wake him. She stood on my porch looking slightly harried, her perfect blowout from this morning now slightly deflated, her phone clutched in one hand as always. Traffic was a nightmare, she offered by way of greeting and explanation for her lateness. Is he ready to go? He's asleep, I said quietly, stepping back to let her in. Come see. Caroline's expression softened when she spotted Erwin on the couch, the transformation striking. For all her faults, her love for her children was genuine and deep. She crossed the room with the silent efficiency of a mother practiced in transferring, sleeping children, and gently stroked his hair. He looks so much like Dad when he sleeps, she whispered, and for a moment, we were united in this observation, in our shared love for both Arthur and Erwin. He has Arthur's curiosity, too, I replied. And his mechanical mind. We built a remarkable marble run this afternoon. Caroline straightened up, the tender moment passing as quickly as it had arrived. I should get him home and into proper pajamas. Rudy's waiting with dinner. Actually, I said carefully, I was hoping we could talk first. About yesterday. Her shoulders tensed visibly. Mom, I already told you it was just a slip of the tongue. I was distracted, thinking about the Westerfield case, and it just came out wrong. Nanny Martha, I said, the words still bitter on my tongue. That's what Erwin called me today at preschool. Caroline had the grace to look momentarily abashed. The kids at his daycare all have nannies. He probably just picked it up there. Did he? I challenged quietly. Or has that become how you refer to me at home? Her silence was answer enough. I gestured toward the kitchen table where I'd set out 2 glasses and a bottle of wine, Arthur's favorite Cabernet that we'd always saved. For important family discussions. Erwin will sleep for at least another half hour, I said. Let's sit down. Reluctantly, Caroline followed me to the table, checking her phone once more before setting it face down, a concession to the seriousness of the conversation. I poured us each a glass of wine and took a moment to gather my thoughts. Do you remember? When you were 7, I began, and you wanted that elaborate dollhouse from the Harriman's department store window, the Victorian with the working electric lights and hand-painted details. Caroline looked confused by this apparent non sequitur, but nodded slowly. It cost $300, a fortune for us then, I continued. Arthur and I were still paying off loans for the second store location. But you wanted it so desperately, had your heart set on it. You bought it for my birthday, Caroline said, a reluctant smile touching her lips at the memory. I played with that dollhouse until I was 13. We didn't buy it, I corrected gently. I made it. Spent 3 months working late into the night after you were asleep, building it from scratch, wiring the tiny lights, painting every miniature brick and shingle. Arthur helped with the roof structure. We couldn't afford to buy that dollhouse, but we found a way to give you what you wanted anyway. Caroline's expression shifted, genuine surprise replacing her earlier defensive posture. I never knew that. I always thought that we bought it, I finished for her. Just like you thought we always had money for private school tuition, for summer camps, for college without student loans. But none of that came easily, Caroline. Everything we provided for you, everything we've helped provide for Maggie and Erwin, came from decades of hard work, careful planning, and sometimes significant sacrifice. I took a sip of wine, feeling the warmth of it and of the memories strengthening my resolve. When Arthur died, I continued, I was devastated beyond words. You know this. What you may not fully understand is how your children became my anchors in that grief. When you asked me to watch Erwin while you returned to work after maternity leave, it wasn't a burden, it was a lifeline. Caroline shifted uncomfortably. I know, Mom, and we've always appreciated. Please let me finish, I interrupted gently. When I started caring for Maggie after preschool, then taking Erwin 2 full days a week, I did it out of love. I rearranged my retirement plans, canceled the painting classes I'd registered for, postponed trips I'd dreamed of taking with your father. I did all of that willingly, joyfully even, because being with my grandchildren filled a hole in my heart that Arthur's passing had created. I reached across the table and placed my hand over hers, a bridge across the growing divide between us. But somewhere along the way, Caroline, your appreciation turned into expectation. My willingness to help became, in your mind, an obligation to serve. And eventually, that service was reframed, not just in your mind, but in the community, at your children's school, perhaps even in my grandchildren's understanding, as employment. I became just the nanny. Caroline withdrew her hand, her defenses visibly rising again. You're overreacting to a simple verbal slip. Of course, we appreciate everything you do. Appreciation is expressed, Caroline. Through words, through actions, through reciprocity. When was the last time you asked about my interests outside of childcare? When did you last inquire about my design work, or the foundation board I still serve on, or my friends, or my health beyond whether I'm well enough to watch the children? Her silence spoke volumes. Do you know that Agnes has been encouraging me to write a book about residential design for 3 years? That the Westridge Gallery asked me to curate their spring exhibition? That I've been offered a position teaching design at the community college? Caroline's expression registered genuine surprise. No, you never mentioned any of that. Because you never asked, I said simply. And more tellingly, because I turned them all down to be available for your children on your schedule. Caroline's phone buzzed against the table. She glanced at it reflexively, but, to her credit, didn't reach for it. What do you want from me, Mom? She asked, a hint of her courtroom directness returning. An apology? Fine. I apologize for the comment yesterday. It was thoughtless and disrespectful. What I want, I said carefully, is for you to understand something important about our family dynamic moving forward. I am not your employee. I am not your children's nanny. I am their grandmother, your mother, and a woman with her own identity, accomplishments, and choices. I rose from the table and retrieved the folder I'd prepared earlier, placing it between us. Which brings me to what we need to discuss before you take Erwin home tonight. There have been some changes to the children's trust fund and to the ownership of the lake property, changes you should be aware of. Caroline's eyes narrowed with sudden, sharp interest. What changes? What have you done? The maternal authority in my voice must have surprised us both as I replied, only what is necessary to ensure respect for my role in this family. Now, shall we review the documents together like the two professional women we both are? Her gaze dropped to the folder, then rose to meet mine with new wariness, perhaps finally beginning to understand that just the nanny had far more influence over this family's future than she had realized, and was prepared to use it. Caroline stared at the folder between us as if it might contain a venomous snake. With measured deliberation, I opened it and removed the first document, the trust fund amendment signed yesterday. As you know, I began in the calm, assured tone I once used with difficult design clients. When Arthur passed away, his life insurance policy and investment portfolio came to me. Additionally, when I sold my interest in the design firm 3 years ago, that capital combined with our savings created a substantial estate. Caroline nodded impatiently. Yes, Mom, we've discussed this before. The estate planning, the eventual inheritance. What's changed? Everything, I said simply, sliding the document toward her. Yesterday, I formalized the trust fund for Maggie and Erwin's benefit. It contains $3.2 million currently, with provisions for their education, health care, and eventual financial independence. Caroline's eyes widened as she scanned the document, her legal training allowing her to quickly grasp the implications. You've named yourself sole trustee, she said, her voice carefully controlled. Rudy and I were supposed to be co-trustees. That was always the plan. Plans change, I replied. The trust is structured with specific milestones for distribution. Education expenses paid directly to institutions. Healthcare needs covered as they arise. Principal distributions at ages 25, 30, and 35. With provisions encouraging entrepreneurship and continued education. Caroline flipped through the pages with increasing agitation. These are massive changes, made unilaterally, without any discussion with us. Do you realize how this looks? How this undermines our authority as parents? This has nothing to do with parental authority, I countered. This is about financial stewardship. The trust protects the children's inheritance from being redirected toward adult priorities. What's that supposed to mean? Caroline's tone sharpened. I met her gaze steadily. It means I've observed how you and Rudy manage money. The constant home renovations, the luxury vehicles traded in every 2 years, the vacations to exclusive resorts. These are your choices to make with your income. But the children's legacy is separate. So you don't trust us. It wasn't a question. I trust that you love your children, I said carefully. I don't trust that you understand the value of money earned through hard work rather than inheritance. It's not your fault. Perhaps Arthur and I shielded you too much from the realities of building wealth from nothing. I removed the second document from the folder, the lake house transfer papers. Additionally, I've transferred the lake property into the trust. It will be held for the children's benefit until they're adults. At that point, they can decide collectively whether to keep it in the family or sell it. Caroline's face flushed with anger. The lake house was supposed to come to me. Dad always said. Arthur said many things about his hopes for the property, I interrupted gently. But legally, it passed to me upon his death. My decision about its future is final. This is punishment, Caroline said, pushing the papers away. You're punishing me for one careless comment at a PTA meeting by rewriting our entire family's financial future. I shook my head. This isn't punishment, Caroline. It's clarification. For too long, our relationship has existed in a state of unspoken expectations and assumptions. You assumed my time, my resources, and eventually my identity were yours to define and allocate. I allowed that assumption to stand unchallenged out of love for you and the children. I took a steadying breath before continuing. Yesterday's public diminishment was simply the catalyst for changes I should have made years ago. Changes that restore balance and mutual respect to our relationship. Caroline was silent for a long moment, legal mind clearly calculating implications, options, potential challenges to what I'd done. Finally, she asked, Is this arrangement permanent, or are you willing to reconsider once you've made your point? The question revealed so much about how she viewed this situation as a temporary power play rather than a fundamental reset of our dynamic. The trust structure is established, I said firmly. However, our personal relationship moving forward remains entirely open to renegotiation. That part depends on both of us. And what exactly do you want this new relationship to look like? Caroline asked, wariness evident in her tone. I closed the folder and met her eyes directly. I want to be recognized as your mother and your children's grandmother, not their nanny, not their babysitter, not unpaid help. I want my time respected, my boundaries acknowledged, my identity outside of childcare validated. I want to be consulted rather than commanded, appreciated rather than expected, included rather than dismissed. I gestured towards still sleeping Erwin. Most importantly, I want my grandchildren to know me as the woman who helped build everything this family has. The businesses, the foundation, the legacy of values beyond mere wealth. I want them to know their real family history, not the sanitized version that begins with privilege rather than perseverance. Caroline's phone buzzed again. This time she glanced at it and sighed. It's Rudy. He's wondering where we are. She looked back at me, conflict evident in her expression. This is a lot to process, Mom. You've essentially rewritten the rules without warning. No, I corrected gently. I've simply stopped playing by rules I never agreed to in the first place. There's a difference. As if on cue, Erwin stirred on the couch, rubbing his eyes and looking around in momentary confusion. "Mommy?" he called, spotting Caroline at the table. "I'm here, sweetie," she answered, her tone softening as it always did with her children. I gathered the documents and returned them to the folder as Caroline went to Erwin. My position was clear. The advantage I'd held quietly for years, financial control, was now explicit. The choice about what came next rested largely with Caroline. How she responded would determine much about our future relationship. The following morning, I stood in the cereal aisle of Riverside Market, contemplating the excessive variety of breakfast options, when I heard someone call my name. Turning, I saw Patricia Winters, the PTA president who had witnessed Caroline's dismissive comment yesterday. "Martha, I'm so glad I ran into you," she said, wheeling her cart alongside mine. Her smile seemed overly bright, almost compensatory. "I wanted to check in after yesterday's meeting. That was, well, quite uncomfortable." I maintained a pleasant expression. "Yes, it certainly was." Patricia lowered her voice conspiratorially. "I had no idea you were Caroline's, that you worked for Caroline's family. You've always presented yourself as—" "I am Maggie and Erwin's grandmother," I interrupted firmly. "Not their nanny, not their employee. Caroline misspoke yesterday." Patricia's expression registered surprise, then embarrassment. "Oh, I'm so sorry. The way she said it, we all assumed—" She trailed off, clearly floundering. "Yes, that was precisely the problem," I replied, keeping my tone even. Caroline created a misperception that needed correction. The moment brought me right back to yesterday's humiliation with perfect clarity. I could still feel the weight of the silence that had fallen after Caroline's words, the subtle shift in how the other committee members looked at me, the instant demotion from respected community member to household staff. "You're just the nanny I hired for the children. She doesn't need to be included in the school planning committee." The words had landed like physical blows. I hadn't immediately responded. Shock had rendered me momentarily mute. The committee chair, a kindly older gentleman named Stephen Bennett, had looked between Caroline and me with confusion. I thought, "Didn't you mention this was your mother, Mrs. Patterson?" he'd asked Caroline. Caroline had been focused on her phone, typing out an email. "What?" "Oh yes, she's my mother, but she watches the kids for us. Full-time, essentially." "Mom, didn't you need to pick up Erwin soon? You probably don't have time for committee obligations." The dismissal had been so complete, so casual, delivered without even looking up from her phone. As if my time existed solely to accommodate her schedule. As if my interest in my grandchildren's education was irrelevant. As if my identity beyond childcare provider had ceased to exist in her worldview. Now, standing in the grocery store facing Patricia's awkward attempt at clarification, I realized how thoroughly that moment had shattered something fundamental between Caroline and me. "Well," Patricia said brightly, clearly eager to move past the uncomfortable topic, "we would love to have you on the planning committee regardless. Your input about the advanced reading program was actually quite insightful." "Thank you," I replied. "I'll consider it. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to finish my shopping." As I continued through the store, my mind returned to the aftermath of yesterday's meeting. I had walked to my car in a daze, the registration form still clutched in my hand. Another mother from the committee, someone I'd known casually for years, through community events, had actually asked if I needed directions to the staff parking area. The assumption had been that immediate, that complete. On the drive home, I'd replayed hundreds of small moments that suddenly appeared in a new, harsh light. Caroline introducing me at Maggie's ballet recital as our childcare. Rudy explaining my presence at their holiday party to his colleagues as the children's caretaker. The increasing frequency with which they scheduled my time without consultation, the casual way they discussed vacation plans in front of me, assuming I would be available to watch the house and care for their pets. The invisibility had been gradual, incremental, almost imperceptible in its progression. From mother to grandmother to helper to nanny, each step so small I had barely noticed the demotion until it was complete and publicly declared. By the time I'd arrived home yesterday, my shock had crystallized into something harder and more determined. The phone call to Agnes, the decision to restructure the trust, the resolution to transfer the lake house, all had flowed from that moment of painful clarity. As I finished my shopping and loaded groceries into my car, my phone chimed with a text message from Caroline. Maggie asked if you're still coming to her school play tonight. Should I tell her you are? The phrasing was telling, not, will you be at Maggie's play? Or, we hope you'll join us for Maggie's performance. Instead, a question that positioned me as someone whose attendance required confirmation, whose presence was secondary rather than assumed. I typed back simply, I'll be there, 3rd row center, as I promised her last week. 3 dots appeared. Disappeared, appeared again as Caroline composed and reconsidered her response. Finally, about last night, Rudy and I would like to discuss the trust changes. Dinner at our house Sunday? Progress, of sorts. At least she was asking rather than telling, suggesting rather than commanding. A small acknowledgement of my autonomy, perhaps prompted by the revelations about the trust fund. Sunday works, I replied. 3 p.m. I'll bring dessert. As I drove home, I reflected on the complexity of what I'd set in motion. The trust fund restructuring wasn't really about the money. It was about recognition, respect, and the painful necessity of using leverage when reason and relationship had failed. I didn't want to control my daughter. I wanted her to see me, truly see me, as a whole person with value beyond utility. The PTA incident had simply made visible what had been happening for years, the steady erosion of my identity in my daughter's eyes until I became merely a function rather than a person. Just the nanny was the culmination, not the beginning of that diminishment. Now, with the trust documents signed and the lake house transferred, I had Caroline's attention. The harder part would be rebuilding the mutual respect that should have underpinned our relationship all along, assuming Caroline was willing to try. Maggie's school play was a charming adaptation of The Wizard of Oz, with my granddaughter cast as Dorothy. I arrived 30 minutes early to secure good seats, bringing flowers for Maggie and my camera to document the performance. The elementary school auditorium buzzed with excited parents and relatives finding seats and chatting in anticipation. Had just settled into my 3rd row center seat when I heard a familiar voice behind me. Martha! I didn't expect to see you here tonight. I turned to find Heather Whitmore, Rudy's mother, making her way toward me with her husband Gerald in tow. The Whitmores were old money, with the polished manners and subtle condescension that often accompanied generational wealth. Hello, Heather, Gerald, I greeted them. Of course I'm here. Maggie's playing Dorothy. Yes, but after Caroline mentioned your disagreement, we assumed we'd be filling in. That's why we drove in from Lakeside, Heather explained, seating herself beside me. My disagreement with Caroline has nothing to do with supporting my granddaughter, I replied evenly. Gerald leaned forward, his expression sympathetic in a way that immediately put me on guard. Caroline explained the situation to us. These misunderstandings between family members can be so difficult. Did she explain exactly what happened? I asked, curious about which version of events Caroline had shared. Heather patted my hand in, a gesture that managed to be both conciliatory and patronizing. She mentioned you were upset about how your role with the children was characterized. But Martha, dear, surely you understand. Labels are so unimportant compared to the value you provide to the family. The value I provide. As if my worth could be measured only in services rendered. Actually, Heather, labels are quite important when they determine how people are treated, I replied. Especially when they're applied publicly. Before Heather could respond, Caroline and Rudy appeared at the end of our row. Caroline looked tense, Rudy oblivious as usual. They made their way to us, exchanging greetings with other parents as they navigated the narrow space between seats. "Mom, you're here already," Caroline said, her tone neutral but her expression wary. "Hi, Mother Dad," she added, greeting her in-laws with kisses on their cheeks. Rudy, handsome but perpetually distracted, gave me a perfunctory nod before turning his attention to his parents. "Glad you could make it. Sorry about the last-minute invitation." "Nonsense," Gerald replied. "We wouldn't miss our granddaughter's performance. Besides, we thought Martha might appreciate the support with the children, given everything." I felt rather than saw Caroline tense beside me. Clearly, whatever version of our disagreement she had shared with her in-laws hadn't included the full financial implications of my decisions. "Actually," I said pleasantly, "I've never needed help attending my grandchildren's events. It's one of my greatest joys." An awkward silence fell over our group, broken when the lights dimmed for the first warning of the performance's imminent start. Caroline leaned toward me, speaking in a low voice. "We need to talk about the trust and the lake house. Rudy's parents don't know about the changes yet." "I assumed as much," I whispered back. Sunday dinner, as we agreed. The Whitmores exchanged glances, clearly intrigued by this cryptic exchange, but the house lights dimmed fully before they could inquire further. The performance was delightful, with Maggie delivering her lines with impressive clarity for an 8-year-old. I took photos at appropriate moments, my heart swelling with pride. Whatever complications existed between Caroline and me, my love for my grandchildren remained pure and uncomplicated. During intermission, our awkward family group made our way to the lobby. I was purchasing a bottle of water when I overheard a conversation that stopped me cold. "That's Caroline Patterson's mother," a woman was saying to her companion. "The one who watches their children. Caroline mentioned she used to be in business or something, but now she's practically their live-in nanny. It's convenient, I suppose, but I could never work for my daughter. It would upset the natural order of things." Her friend responded, "Caroline said the arrangement works perfectly because her mother doesn't have much else going on since her husband died. It gives her purpose, apparently." I stood frozen, the water bottle halfway to my lips. This wasn't a one-time slip of the tongue at a PTA meeting. This was how Caroline routinely described me to her friends and associates, as someone with nothing better to do, someone whose purpose derived from serving her family's needs, someone who worked for her daughter rather than someone who had raised and supported her. I composed myself and turned, coming face to face with the women who had been discussing me. Their expressions shifted from casual gossip to uncomfortable recognition as they realized I had overheard them. "Hello?" I said, pleasantly. "I'm Martha Lawson, Caroline's mother and Maggie and Erwin's grandmother. I don't believe we've met." The women introduced themselves awkwardly as Amanda and Justine, mothers of children in Maggie's class. I maintained my smile, though it felt increasingly brittle. "I couldn't help overhearing your conversation," I continued, calmly. "I'm afraid Caroline has given you a rather incomplete picture of our arrangement. I'm not employed by my daughter, though I do enjoy spending time with my grandchildren. And as for not having much else going on," I paused deliberately. "I currently serve on the boards of 3 charitable foundations, consult for my former design firm on select projects, and am considering teaching at the community college next semester." Their discomfort was palpable. "Oh, we didn't mean... That is, Caroline never mentioned..." "No," I said. "I don't imagine she did. If you'll excuse me, I see my granddaughter waving to me." Indeed, Maggie was bouncing excitedly. At the auditorium doors, still in her Dorothy costume, having spotted me in the crowd. I made my way to her, accepting her exuberant hug and complimenting her performance. As I knelt to her level, straightening the blue gingham bow in her hair. I caught sight of Caroline watching us from across the lobby. Our eyes met over Maggie's. And I saw something flicker in my daughter's expression. Awareness, perhaps, or the beginning of understanding. The second half of the play passed in a blur, my mind processing this newest confirmation of how thoroughly Caroline had redefined my role and identity, not just to herself, but to her entire social circle. By the time the curtain calls finished, and we gathered in the lobby to congratulate the young performers, I had reached a level of clarity that transcended hurt or anger. This wasn't about a single thoughtless comment. This was about a fundamental misalignment in how Caroline and I viewed our relationship, my contributions, and my very identity. The financial adjustments I'd made were necessary, but insufficient. What needed to change was far more fundamental than the management of money or property. What needed to change was the story Caroline told, to others, to herself, and ultimately to my grandchildren, about who their grandmother was and what she deserved. The morning after Maggie's play, I met my oldest friend Agnes for coffee at Riverside Cafe. Beyond being my financial advisor, Agnes had been my confidant since college, the person who knew me before marriage, before motherhood, before any of the roles that now seemed to define me in others' eyes. "You look exhausted," she observed, sliding into the booth across from me. Her silver hair was cut in a sleek bob that complemented her sharp features and sharper mind. "I take it the school play was eventful?" I recounted the overheard conversation, the Whitmore's condescension, and Caroline's evident embarrassment when I'd confronted her afterward about how she portrayed me to her friends. "She actually tried to defend it," I said, stirring my coffee absently. "Said she was simplifying our arrangement for people who wouldn't understand the nuances of our family dynamic." Agnes snorted. "That's convenient. Simplifying by erasing your entire identity beyond childcare provider." "Exactly," I sighed. "The trust fund changes got her attention, but I'm not sure she truly understands why I made them." Agnes leaned forward, her expression serious. "Martha, I've been watching this situation evolve for years. Caroline has been taking advantage of your grief and your love for those children. She's been exploiting your generosity while systematically diminishing your role and identity." "That seems harsh," I protested weakly, still instinctively defending my daughter. "She's busy, stressed with her career and the children. So are thousands of other professional mothers who don't conscript their own mothers as unpaid staff." Agnes countered firmly. "Martha, when was the last time Caroline asked about your interests, your needs, your life beyond availability for childcare?" I fell silent, unable to recall a recent example. The lake house transfer and trust changes were necessary, Agnes continued, but they're just the beginning. You need to reclaim your life, not out of spite, but because you deserve an identity beyond Caroline's mother, or Maggie and Erwin's grandmother. "But I love being with the children," I said, feeling torn. "Their presence in my life after Arthur died, it saved me." "And that connection is precious," Agnes agreed. "But it should complement your life, not consume it. Remember when you talked about taking that watercolor class? Or joining the Historical Society's Architectural Preservation Committee? What happened to those plans?" Caroline started her partnership track. The children needed more consistent care. The pattern was clear even as I spoke it aloud. Agnes reached across the table and covered my hand with hers. "Martha, Arthur wouldn't want this for you. He wouldn't want you surrendering your passions, your identity, your autonomy, even for the grandchildren he never got to meet." Tears pricked at my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome in the public setting. "I know," I whispered. "The financial boundaries you've established are important," Agnes said. "Now you need to establish personal boundaries as well. Not to punish Caroline, but to honor yourself." As we finished our coffee, Agnes's words resonated with growing clarity. This wasn't just about Caroline's public dismissal or the trust fund, or even the lake house. This was about reclaiming the essence of who I was, the woman who had built a design empire alongside her husband, the creative force who had transformed spaces and lives, the person who existed independent of her relationships to others. "What's your next step?" Agnes asked as we prepared to leave. I thought about Sunday's upcoming dinner with Caroline and Rudy, about the conversations that needed to happen, about the boundaries that needed to be drawn. "I'm going to tell my daughter the complete truth," I said with newfound resolve, "about who I am, who I've always been, and who I intend to be going forward, with or without her approval." Sunday arrived with the weight of anticipation. I spent the morning baking Arthur's favorite lemon tart to bring for dessert, a small tribute to his memory and a reminder of the family's shared history beyond recent conflicts. I arrived at Caroline and Rudy's Oakwood Estates home precisely at 3 p.m., noting with a pang how the flowering dogwoods Arthur and I had planted as a housewarming gift were now mature trees, their white blossoms creating a canopy over the circular driveway. Maggie answered the door, launching herself into my arms with the unrestrained enthusiasm of childhood. "Grandma, I saved you the seat next to me at dinner. Did you bring dessert? Is it lemon tart? Dad said you might bring lemon tart." I laughed, hugging her close. "Yes to all those questions. You were wonderful in the play, sweetheart. A perfect Dorothy." Caroline appeared in the foyer, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Her expression was guarded but not hostile. "Hi, Mom. Thanks for coming." "Thank you for the invitation," I replied, maintaining the formality that had crept into our interactions since the trust fund revelation. "Rudy's in the backyard with Erwin. Dinner will be ready in about 20 minutes. I followed Caroline to the kitchen, an expansive space with marble countertops and professional-grade appliances that had been upgraded twice since they purchased the home. The material wealth surrounding my daughter had always seemed both a point of pride and concern for me, pride that she enjoyed comforts Arthur and I had worked so hard to provide for her, concern that she took those comforts for granted. "Can I help with anything?" I offered. "Everything's under control," Caroline replied, checking something in the oven. After a moment's hesitation, she added, "But you could open the wine if you'd like. The corkscrew is in the drawer by the refrigerator." This small inclusion in dinner preparation, being asked to help rather than being served or directed, felt significant. I located the corkscrew and opened the bottle of Cabernet breathing on the counter. "I didn't tell Rudy's parents about the trust changes," Caroline said abruptly, her back still to me as she stirred something on the stove. "Or about the lake house. I thought we should discuss it first, just the four of us. The four of us meaning Caroline, Rudy, the children, and me." The fact that she used this framing rather than just us, or just you and me, suggested she still viewed this primarily as a financial matter affecting the nuclear family, rather than a relationship issue between mother and daughter. "That's probably wise," I agreed, pouring 2 glasses of wine and offering one to her. "There's a personal dimension to this situation that precedes the financial adjustments." Caroline accepted the wine and finally turned to face me fully. "Mom, I need to understand why you did this. If it's about what I said at the PTA meeting—" "It's not just about the PTA meeting," I interrupted gently. "Though that was certainly illuminating. It's about a pattern that's developed over years, Caroline. A pattern where my identity has been steadily reduced to my utility in your family's life." She frowned. "That's a pretty dramatic interpretation of what was honestly just a verbal slip." "Is it?" I challenged quietly. "Then why did I overhear your friends at Maggie's play describing me as your live-in nanny who doesn't have much else going on? Why does Erwin call me Nanny Martha? These aren't slips, Caroline. They're reflections of how you've come to think of me, and by extension, how you've taught others to think of me too." Caroline's cheeks flushed. "I've never intentionally diminished your role." "Perhaps not intentionally," I conceded, "but consistently." When was the last time you introduced me to your colleagues or friends with any reference to my career, my accomplishments, my identity beyond being your mother or your children's caregiver? Her silence was answer enough. The trust fund and lake. House decisions weren't punishment, Caroline. They were self-preservation. A necessary reclaiming of power in a relationship that had become dangerously imbalanced. Caroline set her wineglass down with deliberate care. So this is about power? About showing me that you still control the family finances? No, I said firmly. This is about recognition, about being seen for who I am rather than what I provide. The fact that you immediately frame this in terms of control rather than respect demonstrates exactly the problem. The timer on the oven beeped, momentarily interrupting our conversation. As Caroline turned to attend to dinner, I saw Rudy watching, us from the doorway to the backyard, his expression troubled. How much had he heard? How much did he understand about what was really at stake here? The question of money was the surface issue, but beneath it lay something far more fundamental. The story Caroline had been telling herself about who her mother was, and how that story had gradually erased the woman I had spent a lifetime becoming. Dinner proceeded with forced pleasantness, the adults maintaining a veneer of normalcy for the children's benefit. Maggie chattered about her school play, Erwin described his dinosaur project in meticulous detail, and Rudy asked careful questions about my week. Caroline remained subdued, her thoughts clearly elsewhere. As I helped clear the dinner plates, Rudy suggested the children play in the backyard while the adults had coffee and dessert. Once they'd scampered outside, he closed the patio doors and turned to face me. Caroline told me about the trust changes, he said directly. And the lake house. I think we need to discuss this further. I nodded, serving slices of lemon tart onto dessert plates. I'm open to discussion, Rudy. That's why I'm here. The thing is, he continued, accepting a plate, we've been counting on certain assumptions about the children's education and our eventual inheritance. These changes impact our financial planning significantly. The bluntness of his statement, the explicit acknowledgement that they had been counting on my money, confirmed exactly why the trust restructuring had been necessary. Your financial planning should never have been predicated on inheritance, I replied evenly. That's not prudent for anyone, regardless of family circumstances. Caroline rejoined the conversation, coffee cups in hand. Mom, what Rudy means is that we've structured our lives with certain expectations. The children's private school tuition, summer camps, the club membership. These are commitments we've made based partially on your previous assurances about the trust and inheritance. My assurances that the children would be provided for remain intact, I pointed out. The trust still covers educational expenses. What's changed is who controls the disbursements and the timeline for access to the principal. It feels like a withdrawal of trust, Caroline said, her voice tight. Like you don't believe we can manage the children's inheritance responsibly. What it actually reflects, I corrected gently, is my concern about boundaries and recognition of my role. The financial adjustments followed the relationship breakdown, not the other way around. Rudy frowned. I'm not sure I follow. What relationship breakdown specifically? I appreciated his directness, even if it revealed how little attention he'd paid to the dynamic between his wife and me over the years. Caroline has increasingly positioned me as an employee in this family, rather than a mother and grandmother, I explained. The nanny comment at the PTA meeting was simply the public culmination of a pattern that's been developing for years. That's not fair, Caroline protested. I've always appreciated your help with the children. Appreciation isn't the issue, I interrupted. Recognition is. Do you introduce me to people as a successful businesswoman who ran her own design firm for 30 years? As someone who serves on foundation boards? As a person with expertise, accomplishments, interests beyond childcare? Or am I simply the person who watches the children? Caroline's silence spoke volumes. The trust fund and lake house decisions got your attention, I continued. but they're symptoms, not causes. What needs to change is more fundamental than financial arrangements. Rudy looked thoughtful. What exactly are you asking for, Martha? Respect, I said simply. For my time, my identity, my autonomy. I want to be Grandma Martha to my grandchildren, not their nanny. I want to be seen as a whole person by my daughter, not merely a convenience. I turned to Caroline directly. And practically speaking, I want to reclaim parts of my life I've put on hold for years. I'm accepting the teaching position at the Yati Community College this fall. I'm joining the Historical Preservation Committee. I'll still be part of the children's lives, but on balanced terms that honor my needs as well as yours. Caroline looked genuinely startled. Teaching position? When did this happen? The offer has been extended 3 times over the past 2 years, I replied. I declined previously because my schedule was structured entirely around your needs and the children's activities. Rudy cleared his throat. That seems reasonable, actually. Martha deserves her own life and interests. Caroline shot him a betrayed look before composing herself. Of course, Mom deserves her own interests. But what? About the children? They depend on her schedule being available to them. The children will adapt, I said firmly. They'll learn that Grandma has commitments and passions beyond them, which is actually a healthy lesson. And they'll still have plenty of quality time with me, just on a more structured, mutually agreed upon schedule. And if we need emergency childcare? Caroline asked, the real concern emerging. If Erwin gets sick at school or Maggie's after-school program is canceled, then you'll do what other parents do, I replied calmly. You'll adjust your own schedules, call on your backup resources, or ask, not assume, if I'm available to help. And sometimes I will be, and sometimes I won't. The shift in dynamics was palpable in the room, a rebalancing of power, expectations, and boundaries that clearly unsettled Caroline, but seemed to make intuitive sense to Rudy. The financial changes remain in place, I added softly, but the relationship changes are entirely up to us. All of us. 3 days after our dinner conversation, I received an unexpected email from Bennett and Frost, a law firm I didn't recognize. The subject line read, Regarding Trust Administration, Patterson Family Trust. My heart sank as I opened it to find a formally worded letter questioning my sudden and potentially capricious changes to the family trust and suggesting a legal review was necessary to ensure the best interests of all beneficiaries. Caroline hadn't simply accepted our new boundaries. She had escalated the situation to legal territory. I forwarded the email to Agnes immediately, then called her office. They've retained counsel, I said when she answered. Caroline and Rudy are challenging the trust modifications. Agnes sighed heavily. I'm not surprised, unfortunately. Let me review what they've sent and consult with our legal team. Don't respond to anything directly. Over the next week, a flurry of legal communications passed between Agnes's firm and Bennett and Frost. The challenges were predictable. Questions about my mental competency to make significant financial decisions, suggestions that I was acting out of temporary emotional distress, arguments that the children's parents should have primary say in trust administration. Meanwhile, Caroline's behavior took a disturbing turn. She canceled my regular time with the children, citing scheduling conflicts. When I called Maggie's school to arrange attendance at her upcoming science fair, I discovered Caroline had actually removed me from the approved visitor list, requiring me to seek her explicit permission for school events. The message was clear. If I wouldn't relinquish control of the financial assets, she would restrict access to what mattered most to me, my grandchildren. Rather than allowing this manipulation to pull me back into the unhealthy dynamic, I took decisive action. First, I documented every canceled visit, every restricted school, event, every attempt to limit my grandparent relationship. Second, I contacted a family mediator named Stephen Markowitz, recommended by Agnes, who specialized in grandparent visitation rights. What Caroline is doing is unfortunately common, Stephen explained during our consultation. Using the children as leverage in financial disputes. But it's not in the children's best interest, and courts increasingly recognize that. I'd prefer to avoid court entirely, I told him. I want resolution, not escalation. Then let's prepare for mediation, he suggested. Document everything, maintain a calm approach in all communications, and focus consistently on the children's welfare rather than the financial aspects. I followed his advice meticulously, keeping my communications with Caroline brief, polite, and child-centered. When she texted that Erwin was too busy with soccer for our planned weekend visit, I responded only with, "Please let Erwin know I'm thinking of him and look forward to seeing him when his schedule permits." When she claimed Maggie was overwhelmed with schoolwork and couldn't talk during our scheduled phone call, I sent Maggie a handwritten note of encouragement instead. Each restriction Caroline imposed was met with dignified acceptance rather than desperate pleading, a strategy Stephen assured me would demonstrate clearly who was actually prioritizing the children's emotional well-being. Simultaneously, I channeled my energy into positive creation rather than conflict. I accepted the teaching position at the community college, began attending historical preservation committee meetings, and volunteered at the local art museum. I reclaimed pieces of my identity that had been submerged during years of prioritizing grandchild care over personal development. The most significant step, however, came after Agnes reported back on the legal challenges to the trust. "They have no grounds," she said confidently. "The trust documentation is impeccable, your mental competency is well established, and the provisions are entirely reasonable. But they're hoping to wear you down with legal fees and emotional pressure. Then, we need to remove the financial incentive altogether," I decided. "I want to make one more change to the trust." "What did you have in mind?" Agnes asked cautiously. "A formal commitment that neither Caroline nor Rudy will ever serve as trustees, regardless of circumstances, and explicit language that any further legal challenges to the trust structure will result in a percentage of the trust being diverted to the community foundation instead." Agnes whistled softly. "That's a significant escalation, Martha. It effectively removes any path for them to gain control now or in the future." "Exactly," I said firmly. "The financial aspect is distracting from the real issue. Once they understand the money is permanently beyond their control, perhaps we can focus on rebuilding the actual relationship." As I signed the additional trust amendment the following day, I felt not vindictiveness but clarity. This wasn't punishment, it was protection. Protection of my grandchildren's financial future, yes, but more importantly, protection of my own hard-won identity and autonomy after years of gradual erosion. The trust had become a symbol of something deeper, my refusal to be diminished, dismissed, or defined solely through my usefulness to others. In asserting control over the assets I had helped build, I was simultaneously reclaiming ownership of my narrative, the story of who Martha Lawson truly was, beyond just the nanny. 2 months after the trust amendments and legal maneuvers, Caroline requested a meeting, just the two of us, at the lake house. Her tone in the email was subdued, lacking the entitled edge that had characterized our recent interactions. I arrived early, walking the familiar shoreline where Arthur had taught Caroline to skip stones as a child. The autumn light danced across the water, golden and nostalgic, reminding me why this property had always held such emotional significance for our family. Caroline's car pulled up precisely at noon. She emerged looking tired but composed, less the polished attorney and more the daughter I remembered from quieter times. "Thank you for agreeing to meet," she said as she approached. No hug, but no hostility either. A cautious neutrality that felt like potential progress. We settled on the deck overlooking the lake, The wooden chairs Arthur had built decades ago still sturdy beneath us. Bennett and Frost have advised us to drop the trust challenges, Caroline began, cutting straight to practicalities as was her way. They've reviewed the amended trust provisions and believe further legal action would be counterproductive. I see, I replied evenly, waiting for her to continue. She drew a deep breath. The past 2 months have been difficult for everyone, especially the children. They miss you. Erwin asks every day when Grandma's coming back. I've missed them terribly, I acknowledged. But the restrictions weren't my choice, Caroline. She nodded, surprising me with this tacit admission. I was angry. I felt like you were punishing me for a thoughtless comment, using the trust and the lake house to make some kind of point. It wasn't about punishment, I said gently. It was about recognition. About establishing boundaries after years of having them ignored or dismissed. Caroline was quiet for a moment, watching a pair of ducks navigate the shoreline. Rudy said something that made me think. He asked what I would want Maggie to accept from her future husband or children. Would I want her to be seen only as childcare? As a financial resource? Would I want her accomplishments and identity minimized the way I've minimized yours? The question had clearly resonated with her in a way my own explanations hadn't. When Maggie played composer in that school assignment last month, Caroline continued, she didn't pretend to be me or one of her teachers. She dressed as you, with the silk scarf and your reading glasses. She told her class her grandmother was an artist who designed beautiful spaces and taught other people to do the same. My throat tightened with unexpected emotion. She sees you, Caroline said softly. Even when I haven't, and I need to do better for her sake as well as yours. It wasn't a dramatic apology or complete capitulation, but from my pragmatic daughter, it was significant, an acknowledgement of the fundamental issue rather than just the financial symptoms. I'd like to start over, she continued, not ignore. What's happened, but move forward with clearer understanding. The children need their grandmother. And she hesitated, vulnerability showing through her composed exterior. I need my mother. Not just for childcare or financial support, but for all the other reasons daughters need their mothers. As the afternoon sun warmed the deck around us, we began the careful work of rebuilding, not the old relationship with its unbalanced expectations, but something new, something based on mutual respect, clear boundaries, and recognition of each other's complete humanity. The trust remained structured as I had established it, the lake house secure in its provisions for the grandchildren's future. But these financial arrangements had become background rather than foreground to the more important work of family reconciliation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.